every evening, multiple evenings throughout a week, those that you lead are at the dinner table with their loved ones talking about you. They're talking about you, man. And the beauty of that is, and that can sound a little daunting, the beauty of that is you control that narrative. Your actions control that narrative. So give them something positive. That doesn't mean you're a pushover. It doesn't mean you have to be liked, but give them something positive to show that you are invested in their growth, their evolving, their development, helping them be something different and better than they were the day before. That's all I ask for.
Welcome back to the Perpetual Growth Podcast, the show where we break down the mindsets, systems, and strategies that will help you to grow in business, in relationships, in leadership, and in life. If you're listening and you haven't already, hit the follow so you never miss an episode. And if you get value today, share this with someone who will appreciate it. It helps more than you can imagine. Now, today, we're diving into a conversation I've been excited about for a long time. My guest is Kyle McDowell, a Wall Street Journal and USA Today bestselling author, internationally recognized keynote speaker, and former Fortune 10 executive who led tens of thousands of employees across massive global operations. Kyle built his career inside some of the most complex, politically charged corporate environments and emerged with a radically different leadership philosophy rooted in principle over ego. His book, Begin with We, has become a leadership manifesto, reshaping how organizations think about culture, accountability, collaboration, and excellence. Kyle believes that leadership isn't about positional power. It's about principle-based behavior. It's about fostering environments where people own mistakes, embrace challenges, and operate from shared values instead of siloed ambitions. His signature framework, the 10 W's, has been deployed across major corporations, shifting leadership behaviors from the inside out. So today we're going to break things down like, why corporate environments are failing leaders and what to do about it. The mindset shift from me to we. What creates actual accountability, not just performance compliance. The principles behind the cultures that outperform. And what leaders must internalize if they want to leave a legacy, not a wake. So Kyle is thoughtful, he's direct, and he operates with clarity and conviction from decades at the highest levels of corporate pressure. So Kyle, it's an honor to have you here today on the Perpetual Growth Podcast. Welcome to the show.
Wow, Zach, what an intro, man. Thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to chatting with you and joining this show. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. Well, Kyle, as my audience knows, I always like to start with this one question because I think it cuts straight to the heart of leadership. What does growth mean to you right now in this season of your life?
Wow. Who am I today versus who I was yesterday?
Who are you becoming? Mm-hmm.
That's it for me. But what's interesting about that question? I don't think I would have answered it the same even 5 years ago.
That was literally going to be my next question.
Really?
How has that definition changed from when you were leading in, Fortune 10 level versus where you're at today?
Wow. Yeah. And it's very different for me. And I'm not, I think part of the reason that there's a bit of a disconnect in my two answers is I just turned 50 in July. And with that comes probably a little more self-reflection and kind of introspective thinking, at least for me. And the difference between my answer when I was, eyebrows deep into the corporate world, where I still spend a lot of time, but now it's more of a consultant role versus a W-2 type role. Mm-hmm. And I think my answers, or the reason for this answer, is no different than 99% of your audience. And that is, like everybody else, man, I just got so heads down on this hamster wheel. And I got into this routine where I was delivering really superior results. There was we'll get into it, I'm sure, but there was a cost at delivering those results. And I was not, frankly, I don't think I was cerebral enough to press pause until much later in my career to say, am I evolving? Am I growing? Am I checking all the boxes that I wanted to check, not just the material kind of vanity ones, but am I checking the boxes in terms of my own overall kind of evolution, if you will? Mm-hmm. And I was on that hamster wheel, and you just go so hard, so long for so many years that I think so many of us are guilty of this. We don't press pause long enough to say, am I adding the value that I should be adding? Am I having the impact that I should be having? And is this all this existence is cracked up to be? Yeah. So as I've kind of evolved, and I think part of that evolution is age, certainly.
Yeah.
I'm a lot more self-reflective and introspective than I've ever been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, there's a lot of wisdom in that. I'm curious for you. I mean, you mentioned that a lot of the introspection came from age, but I also believe that there's almost always a moment, and most of us aren't aware of when that moment happens, but there's almost always a moment in time,
Yeah.
an event, a trigger, I look myself in the mirror and I'm like, this is it. I'm done. I've had enough.
Yeah.
What was that moment for you? And what I'm even more curious about is the why.
Yeah. For me, there are probably two, maybe three. And they each had a different impact on my life and my kind of path, if you will. The first is kind of the enough is enough. I was 22, 23 years into my career. At that point, I was leading 4,000 people, and the toxicity and the dysfunction that I observed in the very environments that I was tasked with creating became so palpable that I hit a wall. So some context, man. I was on the doorstep of a divorce that ultimately happened. I was not in good health. I wasn't a nice person to be around, if truth be told. And I was at this point where I was like, "There's got to be more to this existence than what I'm living now." I was working as hard as I'd ever worked. At that time, I was also in business school, and the toxicity and dysfunction that I observed and perpetuated became such an ongoing theme in my brain, and which compelled me to ask myself a lot of questions. And the loudest, most common question was, "Is there a better way?"
Mm.
And that's when enough was enough. So I stepped away, and I don't want to come across naive to your audience. I was a very lucky guy. I am a very lucky guy, and I think there's a combination of hard work that meets opportunity, and we could define that in different ways if you like. But for me, I just reached a point where that question, "Is there a better way?" became so loud I couldn't ignore it. So I stepped away I resigned, and I told myself I was not happy with the leader I had become. And if I was going to go back into an environment even somewhat similar to what I just left, it had to be under a different set of conditions. I needed to be the leader that I always wanted to be, the leader that I never had. And it compelled me to create these principles that you touched on. And I'm sure we'll get to those. But the second, I think, was even more kind of profound for me, the second moment. Fast forward another 7, 8 years later, I'd had tremendous success in the organization where I created these principles, transformed that organization, a multi-billion-dollar firm, transformed it in ways that I never thought possible. Results through the roof that we had never kind of expected or anticipated, but more kind of important to me, which led to this second epiphany, if you will, is I watched bosses transform into leaders. People really started to genuinely give a crap about those in their circle, those around them, and less about results, more about the people, which enabled the results. So I had such a career high, and even kind of some personal growth in there as well, because I learned these principles are applicable not just in my professional life, but in my personal life. And I said, you know what, I'm going to take this show on the road. I was offered a role to lead about 15,000 people, a $50 billion P&L, and I was miserable. And the toxicity that I thought was like the Mount Rushmore toxicity and dysfunction that I lived through and got away from was dwarfed in this new firm, which will remain nameless. I lasted about a year there, and there was a moment in that little scenario that really told me I was in the wrong place. When I first onboarded into this company, you go through all these onboarding workshops and you meet all the executives. And I was senior enough in this firm that the executives that were delivering these onboarding sessions, they were peers of mine. And there was a woman who led a good portion of these onboarding sessions, and she was I think she was an SVP of HR. So she was kind of the person that was responsible for carrying the flag for this place that, kind of evangelizes how great it is to work here. And she was so inspiring and compelling on stage. And later that day, I was in another meeting with her on a completely different topic, business related, not onboarding related. And she was the antithesis of what I observed. I mean, just a real jerk. So I started to pick up on this kind of duplicity inside of this organization. We say a lot of things, we behave wildly differently, um, and just bad actors. It was my first real exposure to people sincerely coming to work to do harm
Mm-hmm.
under the guise of promoting themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that became such a sentinel moment in my life because I recognized how well the stop before that went, the impact that we had collectively. Take it on the road to another organization, and I realized that there are places that the dysfunction is just so big. You're not one person or even a few people aren't going to change that. But what it did, so I had a choice, man. So I got out of that firm after about a year. I had a choice. Do I want to go back into this fray and kind of try to have the luck and success I had in the previous role and try to prove that this organization was an anomaly, or do I have a bigger calling? And it was around that time I started to get phone calls from my team from the organization prior, and they said, "When's the book coming?" And I chuckled. And this is a true story. When's the book coming? I chuckled. I said, I'm no author. I'm not writing a book." And they kind of challenged me. It was the group that challenged me and said, "Well, you came here and did it, and and we're friends for life now. So are you about this?" A question I also replay a lot. Are you about this, or are you just talking about it? So I followed their urging. I wrote the book. It became a USA Today, a Wall Street Journal bestseller. It's changed my life in ways I never could have predicted. But when we talk about growth, man, I had a really, really, really fortunate positive experience that led me down a path. I had a negative experience, the worst of worst experiences that kind of motivated me to do what I'm doing now. So you talk about growth. It's like we can get knocked down and say this sucked, woe is me. Or do we get knocked down and say, no, this is not changing who I am, the mission that I'm on. And that's the path that I chose. And man, am I grateful for it.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing all that. I mean, in many ways that epitomizes one of my personal philosophies. I mean, we can either look at challenges as challenges and take them at face value, or we can find the gift within each. And what's the greater calling? How do we transform this adversity into opportunity? And it sounds like,
you and I, we don't know each other obviously very well, but you seem like a guy who is pretty introspective. Was there a moment or two that you can immediately point to that kind of urged you to follow this introspection and this introspective nature that you have? Like, what was your example of what I just shared?
There's a multitude there too. I started in the small mom and pop 6 to 7 figure business and worked my way up through the 8 and 9 figure ladders as well. And there's handfuls of different experiences. When I was really young, for me, I was, modeling what I saw dad do. And a lot of what that was initially was the very conventional top-down leadership. You do what I say because it's I tell you to do it. Right. And I realized very quickly in business, just because I have such a strong intuition and very powerful sense of empathy and connectedness, that's not going to be a powerful way to motivate people. And it didn't feel good. And if it doesn't feel good, you're not going to want to continue to do it. So I really had to put myself in check multiple times in my early business career and ask that same question. Who do I want to become? Is this the way I want to lead? Why aren't things going and growing the way that I really want them to? And I, came to realize that ultimately, I think this is applicable to any business owner. The number one chokehold in any business is the psychology of its leader. So if you will be the limiting factor, you will be the glass ceiling unless you are willing to take that step back, go internal and evolve. And that happened multiple times throughout my career. I had some of those similar experiences to you where I, as I moved up into the 8 and 9 figure ladders, you're looking at these leaders and in many contexts, I mean, they're beautiful humans. I mean, nobody is perfect. And I also want to emphasize this. This is not about criticism or judgment. It's about observation. Observation is a superpower. But the thing I saw was when there was still that misalignment, I'm like, when there's that lack of congruency between the thing that is being professed externally versus what is being lived internally, it doesn't feel fulfilling. And success without fulfillment is the biggest failure. I'm like, so I just had to take that step back. So there were multiple points over time. And, I'm really curious, Kyle, I want to go back to something that you said. When you were talking about leadership, and again, I want to honor your vulnerability in this and talking about the divorce because something popped into my mind, and then I want to segue into some of the leadership principles that evolve from your life experiences. I've come to realize that one big challenge for many people is that we haven't compartmentalized areas of our life. And what I mean by that, and I mean this in a healthy context, is I'll just use this example. It's like the lawyer gets rewarded for what? For putting people on the witness stand all day long, interrogating, ask them questions, right? But the problem is if that lawyer goes home and they apply those same principles that they're rewarded for in public to their private life, to their spouse, to their kids, and so on, that relationship dynamic is not likely to be successful. And, you talked about the leader you were versus obviously, it's very clear who you've become. Was that a component potentially of some of those? I don't ever like to look at them as failures because they're more lessons. Was that a component to those lessons that you learned earlier in life that, could have contributed to the divorce? I also know that there's sometimes it's just the wrong people, right? Yeah. There's a misalignment in those values too, and that's okay. Yeah. But I'm curious for you, did you see the person you were showing up as that you did not like in business also showing up in similar ways in your personal life, and how did that affect you?
Wow. Lots in there to unpack. My work was my identity. And that's not a good thing. And I coach people now to say the further you can separate your identity from your work, the more impactful your work will be, because you're less biased. We can focus on what's right instead of being right. Our ego doesn't drive our decisions. The right thing drives our decisions. In my case, that identity is what kind of drove me to work 6-7 days a week. I was on the road 3 or 4 nights a week for a dozen years. So that explains the relationship fracturing, but it also explains the health being not what it could or should have been. And I prioritized that side of my existence demonstrably more than I gave any other prioritization in my circle, including my wife, my ex-wife. So for me, it was more about, prioritizing the wrong things. But what I think is so fascinating about that question is because there's another layer in that question that I think I did not appreciate until the last maybe 5 or 10 years. And it's this: the identity that I had kind of built for myself and my behaviors and how I carried myself in the workplace was not the same person outside of the workplace. As a matter of fact, when I wrote the book, some of my closest friends had no idea that I'd even created these principles that I use inside of the workplace. And there was a moment, and it's almost embarrassing to share the story, but there was a moment, a sentinel moment that told me I was being a hypocrite. And Zach, if you want to insult me, you can call me just about anything. It's going to roll right off my back. You call me a hypocrite. That's for me one of the worst insults you can toss my way.
The 4-letter word.
Grocery shopping one day, and go out like we all do. Go out to the parking lot, unload the cart, throw all my groceries in the truck, and I was that guy. I took my grocery cart, put it in the parking spot next to me, backed out, started. Didn't take it back like you're supposed to do. Or at least put it in a little cart corral in the parking lot. So I'm pulling out and I look in my rearview mirror and I see that grocery cart sliding across the parking lot. The internal dialogue was this: you are a hypocrite. You're the guy whose number one principle is we do the right thing always. And you just pulled away knowing that you did not do the right thing. As trivial and silly and trite as it sounds, that was the moment that I said, you are being a hypocrite. You're leading in a certain way now that you're incredibly proud of. It's driving great results and forming connections that you were never fortunate enough to have in the first 20 years of your career. But you leave the workplace and you don't hold yourself to that same set of standards. So for me, it was back to the heart of your question, the identity I had formed for myself is what ultimately separated me from a few loved ones, including my wife at the time. But it was also an awakening to me in that I was operating under this kind of veil of hypocrisy that it turned out I wasn't super proud of, which, again, talking about growth, I'm a different person outside of work now because I've now established these standards, behavioral standards, that I hold myself accountable to. And you said it, brother. I'm not perfect at it. Every day I fail against one of my own principles. But I've found in the absence of those principles, how do you know if you're living up to any expectation? No one else's expectation, but for yourself. So that's kind of what drove me on the personal side, was the more identity that I had kind of rooted myself in versus who I really was, in this Jekyll and Hyde thing that I played. And now I can proudly, if not arrogantly, even share with you that I am inside, outside, regardless of the environment I'm in. Those principles are still front of mind in nearly everything I do.
I love that. There's two huge takeaways I got right there. One thing that I heard, one of your core beliefs is how I do one thing is how I do everything.
That's it.
Is that fair?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's what's that?
Or don't do it.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's an important standard to hold ourselves to, but that's the second piece, is you've established clear standards, guidelines, principles, values that are your guiding light, your North Star, your target that you are aiming for every single day. And it's progress. It's not perfection. We are humans. We are imperfect beings. Holding yourself, beating yourself up for the mistakes that you make just keeps you focused on the rearview mirror. We have to acknowledge it, honor it, and then figure out what are we going to do next to be a little bit better tomorrow. And I think that's really important, but establishing those values is the first step. And most people don't take the time to do that.
Yep.
It's what is most important to you in life. How do you want to feel? How do you want others to feel after interacting with you? What do you want? How do you want to be remembered? I'm curious for you, how did you go about establishing those values, and talk maybe about how does that segue into the leadership principles that you've created, and what is that bringing into the organizations that you're helping to transform? Because there are a lot of businesses that need help, and it's at every level, small business to the big multi-billion-dollar corporations. It does not matter.
So true. I had what was nothing short of an epiphany. So, I mentioned two firms, right? The company I was with, where, so I left a company, right? I joined a company that I recognized could be the launching pad of real evolution of my leadership, caring more about the people around me and the connections that I had an opportunity to make versus focusing on the results at all costs type mentality. And by the way, I think it's worth noting, and I would love to circle back to this if we have a moment, your realization watching a leader above you behave in ways that you knew was probably not a long-term recipe for sustained success, right? Which we all are, I think, exposed to. And I was no different. But I want to circle back to your story, if we can, a bit later, because it's one thing to see a leader that behaves in ways that are not as impactful as they could be, don't add the value, don't show the real human behind the title. It's one thing to look at that and say, I can be better than that. But it's a very different thing when it's your father. So I want to talk about how you kind of transcended that. But for me, when I took that role and recognized there was an opportunity to lead differently, be the leader I never had, it was the night before. I was about 60 days into that role. And as I mentioned, that was about a 15,000 person organization. We had offices all over the country. And I was 60 days in, and I requested the top 40 or 50 leaders of this organization to come together. And it would be my chance to kind of to launch this transformation initiative that I was essentially hired to do. It wasn't a dysfunctional or toxic place, but there were a lot of silos. There were lots of opportunities to be more collaborative and work more kind of cohesive, as cliche as that sounds, but it's true. When you have an organization that size, there are pockets of toxicity, and there are pockets of really high performing areas. But we have to recognize that, leader A and leader B, if one is winning and the other is not, then collectively we're not winning. And that was void in this organization. 60 days in, I asked everybody to come in for us to try to kick off this transformation. And the night before was a real gut check moment for me. And this is when the epiphany hit. I was in my hotel room. It was probably about midnight. And I knew I had to be on stage the next morning to talk to this group of leaders and kind of share with them my philosophy, something that we've all seen, right? New leader comes in, they come in, they tell us, their history, what they're there to do for us and how they're kind of like this Braveheart, follow me and everything's going to be fine. We've all seen that. I've been that guy kind of talking that talk, but I knew that evening that this was my chance. It was the gut check moment. And I'm in my hotel room, had my laptop in my lap. I'm in that day's suit still. I had a dinner that evening, and I just started to play the myriad of scenarios where my leader, my boss, or the organization more broadly left me feeling less than whole, as if I was not adding value, as if I was just a kind of a rung in a ladder or a cog in a machine. And these statements started to kind of just jump out at me. And then I juxtaposed those negative experiences with the handful of times where someone really showed genuine interest in my growth and in me. And there are a couple folks who along my path that saw things in me that I didn't see in myself, gave me opportunities that I didn't think I was ready for. And then the statements started to kind of blast through my brain again. And then I just started typing, and I ended up with these 10 sentences, and they each begin with the word we. And some of them were crafted to say, this is how we're not going to behave. We do the right thing always, right? I'd been exposed to people doing things that were not the right thing. For example, a leader saying, hey, Kyle, change this number in your spreadsheet to match a number on my spreadsheet that I already shared with my boss, really kind of unethical behavior. And I did it. So after a couple hours of work, I didn't have this fancy PowerPoint, which we all know is almost a requirement for any good corporate meeting, is you got to have lots of PowerPoint slides. But the primary spirit of what I created was these 10 principles. I'm not super creative. I called them the 10 We's the very next morning, shared them with the team. And that kicked off a transformation of profound impact, as I mentioned, not just from a KPI metric perspective, but watching people really come out of their corporate shells and become humans and lead in a way that really pulled the best out of everyone around them. That night changed my life, and it put me on this kind of journey to evangelize these principles in whatever way possible, which, as I mentioned, ultimately led me to kind of have them shift into my personal existence as well. But it all started with this internal dialogue and reflection that you just touched on a moment ago, that so many of us don't ever take the time to do. And it was like, okay, if I don't want to be seen as this robotic corporate leader, then I need to show them what they can expect from me. And that's how I led the conversation. You don't have to adopt these 10 principles. This was not some top-down initiative. We didn't kick off we didn't print a bunch of banners and all this fancy stuff. We didn't write them on the wall yet. It ultimately all came, not from my urging. But I said, here's what you can expect from me. I want you to hold me accountable to these principles. And by the way, historically, I would have never taken that approach. It was always about my expectations of you. Now I pivoted. I said, these are the principles by which I want you to judge me and hold me accountable, but expect me to do the same for you. But it starts with me living them. And that was, I could see about half the room was really energized. I won't bullshit you. There was a quarter of the room that was optimistic, but there was a group that was just incredibly obstinate. They thought I was full of it. But I view those folks as a challenge. And if I'm the guy on stage saying we challenge each other and we embrace challenge, principles 8 and 9, then I have to show it. I have to live it. So every time they were difficult with me, I didn't view that as an obstinate employee. I viewed that as someone who had been burned by someone in their past, a boss who had treated them in the same ways that I felt that compelled me to write these principles. And I have to show them that it doesn't have to be this way. There is a better way. And it took probably 6-9 months maybe before I started to really hear those same words play back to me, and I could see it in others' interactions with their teams. And then I knew we were onto something. And this momentum created this change inside this organization that I am forever grateful for. And Zach, I still have one-on-ones with many leaders of that team, and I haven't worked there in almost a decade.
I love that. I mean, that's the power of relationships and transformation, though. I mean, people, nobody ever forgets an experience.
Yeah.
And that's the big thing that we have to remember is nothing trumps an experience. We can talk at people all day, but until we create an experience that really creates that internalized emotion, that anchor, that moment in time where you go back and you're like, wow, that was the moment in time that things shifted, or at least they began to shift.
That was it.
There's a tremendous power in those experiences. I have so many things I would like to peel back. One of the questions that's coming to my mind is, it almost feels as though, and I don't know if this is an externalized thing, I don't know if this is an internalized thing, but it's almost like business leadership. You've talked about siloing within the organization, siloing within departments and teams, but there also can be a siloing in mindset. And it's like these things are separate. Like I can't do one and do the other simultaneously.
Right.
And I'm curious both and whether this is easier for you to illustrate from your personal perspective or through the change that you've been so effective at creating within the organizations that you've worked with. How do you navigate that conversation? How do you set that frame with the leadership, the people in leadership positions? And actually, frankly, leadership happens at every level. Like we have to learn to lead ourselves first. And I think that's a really important principle that everyone needs to hear, regardless if you're in an entry level position, quote unquote, or you're at the top. And I do believe also at the same time, leadership starts at the top. It's going to be a trickle down effect. How do you get people to start to internalize those principles and eliminate that silo and instead create that synergy so it's a working part of them when they are working? And I hope that question makes sense. We have leadership conversations about how we're showing up, the impact that we have, and then there's how we run the business. And they can oftentimes end up as, like I said, these siloed and separate functions is almost the way that it feels or appears.
Yeah.
How do you synergize those things?
It reminds me of a quote that, if you'll bear with me, I think will make sense. And it's a famous quote from many, many years ago. It's from Mike Tyson, of all people. It's about plans. Everybody has a plan until what?
Get punched in the face.
So they get punched in the face.
Yeah.
Business and leadership is no different. So we can have these really fancy culture sessions. We can say we're going to be this organization. We're launching this big transformation effort until adversity strikes. And then when adversity strikes, we let go of those principles or the values or the behavioral guardrails that we've established, right? So for me, as I've mentioned a handful of times now, first principle is we do the right thing always. Yeah. Well, when you get punched in the face, doing the right thing can be a little foggy. It can be hard to find because now we've got adversity. We got maybe a difficult client staring at us. We've got some cutbacks to make, whatever the scenario is. It makes the principles that we espouse a little slippery.
Well, people tend to default to their primitive behavior, primitive habits. It's like we've set the standard for who we want to become, but there's a whole different thing when there's the tremendous difference between this is who I am when things are comfortable and this is who I am when things get hard.
I know.
And true integration is trying to find that middle ground. Would you agree with that?
Exactly right, man. Yeah. That's exactly right. But you're being watched as the leader. You're being watched all the time, especially when the chips are down. How's Kyle going to react to this adversity? Mm-hmm. Kyle's the guy that says we own our mistakes. Is he going to own his? Kyle's the guy that says we pick each other up. When I have that mistake, when I make the mistake, is he going to be there to pick me up or am I getting fired? All of this boils down to, and you kind of hinted at it in a way, I think, you can talk at people all you want. You can talk at them all you want. You can talk to them and with them all you want. Mm-hmm. Nobody cares until your actions are aligned with those words. Yeah. Especially in a position of authority, or, we talk about leaders and you nailed it, brother. You don't have to have the title to be a leader, but if you're in a position of authority, it doesn't make you a leader. You are being watched. And that's, back to the heart of your question. How do you get people to kind of knock those silos down? How do you get them to work more collaboratively? How do you get them to buy into the messages that you're trying to promote? Can say it all day long, man, but if they see me living it any other way or contrary to anything I've said, trust is almost impossible to establish at that point. And whatever trust you might have had, it's going to start to erode because they see you're in it for you, and the things that you are evangelizing, that you're on stage saying, here's who we are, here's how we're going to behave, is really theater. Or he cares about it a lot until he's compromised or he's in a position to make a tough call. So I learned during this, and I don't think I was as aware of this the first 20 years of my career. What I said is not as important as the action, how I behave. And I mentioned earlier of that group of leaders that morning, a quarter of them were obstinate. That was the group that I knew had a really kind of outsized focus. Their aperture was really dialed in on me, and I had to live the words that I was saying. Now, what happens though is when you're consistent in that, and And when you do slide or deviate from it, you throw your hand up and you say, man, I blew it. I'm sorry. I blew it, which is a level of vulnerability that most of us aren't comfortable with, which takes some practice and getting used to. But what happens when they see that, people start to take a lot more ownership in their roles. They're not taking orders any longer. They're taking ownership. You move from compliance to commitment, real commitment in the cause, what we're doing here. And what I would do back in those days, it's not quite the same in most environments today, because back in those days, video calls were not as kind of regular or prominent as they are now. If you recall back in those days, this was 2017. When you're geographically dispersed, we would get on phone calls. We would just, everybody dials into the toll-free number. You can't see each other. And I admit what I would do when I started to sense this momentum and things were starting to really shift. I would dial into calls, but I wouldn't announce myself. They wouldn't know I was on the line. And I started to hear my words being replayed in those meetings in a good way. Like the 10 We's became part of our daily vernacular. And you would hear people challenging each other and using the principles, the 10 We's, as kind of the foundation, the safe space to say, listen, this is who we are. It's how we operate. We've seen Kyle do this. And that's when I knew there was a real change happening. You could see people behaving in ways that they had not behaved to date. And that's when bosses came out of their shell to become real leaders, because they felt empowered to do so. They knew that the new guy was, I had to earn that, but they knew the new guy was not going to be the one to bang his fist on the desk when something went slightly off skew. And that was the most rewarding time. And that's what it created this constant reinforcement for me, which is really kind of fun to be a part of. It's like, all right, I've set this standard. I see people following it. Now it becomes, I don't want to let them down, which kind of compelled me to really go deep on the principles and never really stray from them. But it's less about telling and more about doing.
Yeah, not do as I say, not as I do. And I love what you just said too, because in my mind's eye, that's one of the highest marks of leadership, is when leadership becomes transcendent, when people are honoring and living the values that we profess when you're not there.
Not in the room.
You're not watching, when they're not being observed. And I think that's really, really powerful. And one thing I'd love to ask you, Kyle, and I would love to hear your thoughts on either end of the spectrum here. From a standpoint of practice and integration, whether this is top-down CEO, owner, or somebody working in the entry-level position, what is one tip, if you had one tip, where they can start to create the change? Whether that's within themselves, whether they're, if they're on the latter end and they're in a more junior position and they're seeing toxicity at the highest level, is that something where they can become the impetus? Or is that in more cases now an evaluation of, is this really the right place for me? And then again, on the latter, as a CEO, where do we start looking internally to start creating the external transformation?
Well, so fascinating question. Think of it this way. In every organization, when we bring a new hire in, we spend a lot of time educating, coaching, teaching them on the things that we will measure their success on or from. The KPIs. Here are the handful of metrics, whether it's a sales quota or some type of widget processing, whatever it is. We teach them how to do their job, the SOPs, the fundamentals, the nuts and bolts of the job. But very few organizations, in fact, almost none, spend an equal amount of time educating, coaching, teaching on here's how we do what we do, the behaviors that we expect from everybody. And it's like anything else. If we don't set a bar, how do we ever achieve that bar? Or how do we know we've ever achieved it? Or what do we lean back into when things are dicey or tough? I just learned during this period of my career that if I am not really conspicuous in establishing my expectations across the board, not just for the widgets that you process or the KPIs that we're going to judge your success or not, but how you get stuff done, how collaborative are you? How do you invite dissenting opinions? How do you hold people accountable when they deviate from our principles that we've kind of established? The real human side of leadership. So when we talk about how do we kind of insert this or start to turn this big battleship called culture around, it has to start with setting expectations. And
Clarity is
in my
power.
principles, the 10 We's, in isolation, each one of them is incredibly simple. They're almost like, yeah, no shit, we're going to do this. Of course we are.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have this group of behaviors, and my principles are they're observable behaviors, and we kind of lean into these observable behaviors, you've established a behavioral standard in ways that I always say ambiguity is the enemy of execution. So if we're not really clear on how we're going to get work done, like it's like, hey Zach, bring me everything you know about why we fell short in our sales targets last month. And you say, got it, Kyle. I've not been specific enough for you to hit the mark for exactly what I'm hoping to see. So you're left to do what? You have to guess. And then you have to guess, well, what kind of mood is the boss in when I put this stuff together? Is he going to hear this openly, or is he going to be judgmental and biased because he helped create some of these things?
Yeah.
So when we're left with this ambiguity and we're not really clear on the behavioral expectations, everybody's going to behave in different ways, thinking that they're kind of contributing to something bigger, but usually it's more reserved for kind of promoting myself and my objectives. So without that really crystal clear, conspicuous establishing of how we expect everybody to behave, and I'm not saying in robotic ways, right? We talk about, we say what we're going to do and then we do it. We take action. We own our mistakes. We pick each other up. We measure ourselves by outcomes, not activity. We challenge each other. We embrace challenge, and we obsess over details. So if you bring me back this sales report that I've requested, or your intel or analysis on what I've asked you to deliver, and you got two different data points for the same metric on two different pages, you didn't obsess over details. There's an error in here. Now, we own our mistakes, so I would expect you to say, yeah, good observation, Kyle, that's fine. My response is we pick each other up. So okay, did you think about this? Let's go back to the drawing board. So without that crystal clear establishing of those expectations, we're kind of running at our own speed in different directions, and we hope things come together. But when you know that you're going to be kind of evaluated on your obsession with those details, when I challenge you about the results that you're giving me to say, I think we can do better, and here's how, or here's why, it's your obligation now to embrace that challenge. It's also one of our principles. So we've established how we expect to behave in these scenarios. And we touched on it a moment ago, Zach, like when things are going really well and our results are through the roof, living by these principles is incredibly easy. But it's when the waters get rough and we're kind of in a moment of adversity, or I call it the suck, we're in the middle of the suck, it's harder to adhere to them and remember them. But it also keeps us really focused when we're able to do so, keeps us really focused on what we're trying to accomplish without this self-preservation, me over you, for someone to win, someone else must lose type paradigm.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, multiple takeaways there, but one of the big things I heard is, and this applies to every part of our lives. I mean, so often we come in with expectations in any relationship dynamic that have never been communicated to the other person.
Right.
And then we hold them accountable to those expectations, anticipating that they're in some way able to read our mind.
Right.
Clarity is a superpower. Clarify and verify over and over and over. And as we wrap up today's episode, I really want to highlight a few big takeaways from this conversation with Kyle. And there's way too many, but I'm going to try and pick three that stand out. One big thing: culture is not what you say, it's what you do and what you tolerate. Kyle made it very clear. Accountability doesn't just come from slogans. It comes from principle-based behavior, which is modeled at the top. Another big one: most leadership dysfunction starts with ego. And these are in my words, not incompetence.
You're killing it.
The shift from me to we, it's not just philosophical, it's operational. And it really is going to determine whether the team is going to fracture or flourish. And I love that you used that word earlier. And then another big one: legacy is built through consistency, not charisma. Leaders don't earn trust through intensity or authority. I mean, there's power in that, but they earn it by showing up the same way when it's hard as when it's easy. And those things alone are worth the replay. If you guys want to go back and take that, really internalize that. Now, Kyle, one last question before we close out. Fast forward 20 years. In 60 seconds, if someone were describing your impact, not your titles, not your resume, what do you hope they would say really stood out for you as a leader?
Kyle's authenticity, his candor, and his self-awareness have compelled me to, if nothing else, consider that there might be a better way. And I would say there is a better way, but people have to find that better way on their own. It's like anything else in this life. I can tell you that you're going to feel better if you burn more calories and take in fewer calories. I could tell you're going to feel better if you are more active, if you move more, I could tell you you're going to, psychologically, you're going to kind of grow and evolve if you read more and you're always trying to learn. I could tell you those things, but my leadership legacy, I would love the bumper sticker to say his authenticity, his candor, in the way his self-awareness and his connection with his own ego. It was enough for me to consider a better way. And if I'm lucky, that better way has driven them to create their own principles or adopt the 10 W's and just get out of this robotic kind of, corporate identity that I think many of us believe we have to operate within and serve this identity instead of just being a human being who recognizes the privilege that comes with leadership and the impact you can have. And Zach, I know it's probably a longer answer than you were hoping, but here's the be all end all for me. Every evening, if not every, multiple evenings a night, multiple evenings throughout a week, those that you lead are at the dinner table with their loved ones talking about you. They're talking about you, man. And the beauty of that is, and that can sound a little daunting, like what are they saying? And the beauty of that is you control that narrative. Your actions control that narrative. So give them something positive. That doesn't mean you're a pushover. It doesn't mean you have to be liked, but give them something positive to show that you are invested in their growth, their evolving, their development, helping them be something different and better than they were the day before. That's all I ask for. Just remember that dinner table experience.
I love that. That was incredible. That also makes me want to, we could go into a complete part 2 on this. I mean, the difference between being liked, doing these things and embodying them for the purpose of being liked versus the purpose of structure,
impact
and impact and fulfillment. I love how you talk about candor and self-awareness and authenticity. I mean, I think those are absolute superpowers. And, that's the other thing that's really important to recognize for everybody in the audience is every culture is going to have, every organization is going to have its own culture. And as leadership, it's your duty to really decide what you want that culture to look like. And those are the things that are going to resonate or they're not. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just, who do you want to be? Now, Kyle, this has been phenomenal. Your clarity around principle-based leadership, accountability, and the shift from me to we, it's powerful and it's needed. Now, before we wrap up, where's the best place for our listeners to connect with you, follow your work, dive deeper into the 10 We's?
It's kind of you to offer the opportunity. The book that we've talked about a couple of times is Begin with We, 10 Principles for Building and Sustaining a Culture of Excellence. It's wherever books are sold. Seems like Amazon's probably the fastest path to get it. There's an audio version as well that I narrated. I'm on essentially every social media platform at Kyle McDowell Inc. My website is kylemcdowellinc.com. And I share those with such humility and appreciation for you asking, because I don't use those platforms for vanity purposes. I actually use them to really communicate with readers and folks that follow my work. So that's an open invitation to your audience to reach out.
Beautiful. I love that. And I'm sure they will. And we'll make sure for everybody that's listening, we'll have all of those links in the show notes so you guys don't have to dig and search. And, for everyone that is listening, if today's episode challenged you, if it inspired you, if it gave you something actionable that you can take into your leadership, share it with someone on your team or in your circle. Send it to a leader who wants to elevate the way that they are showing up. If you haven't yet, follow the podcast, leave us a 5-star review, share this episode with someone who leads others. And you can also connect with me on social. If you're a business owner or executive looking to scale with clarity and integrity, you know where to find me. Kyle, thank you again. And to our audience, keep growing, keep leading. I'll see you guys on the next episode. I mean, remember, growth, evolution, it doesn't happen by chance. It happens by choice. We'll see you next time.